Are you wanting deeper connections in your life and work? Maybe especially now as the world we're in? Do you want new ways to build stronger relationships? Does the word partner resonate with you like it does with me? If so, you are in the right place. Welcome to another live episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. If you are here live, just please interact with us because you can get the chance to interact with our wonderful guest you're going to meet in just a second. And while you're here, imagine you're just joining us for a cup of coffee. So share your questions, your comments, and your ideas, is that will make for a better conversation and eventually a better podcast episode. Now, if you're listening to this later, which means you're not here live and you're on the podcast and your podcast platform of choice, you can join us live in the future. You can get access to live episodes in the future and interact with us like the lucky people that are here can do by joining our Facebook or LinkedIn groups to get all access and information about that. Just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn to do that. And today's episode, as many are, is brought to you by Remarkable Masterclasses. Each masterclass is designed to help you become the remarkable leader and human you were born to be. Details on how to get on board for a specific skill or to get discounts in the future can be found at remarkablemasterclass.com. And with that, it's time to introduce my guest. Let's get her in the stream. There she is. That smiling face is Jean Oelwang. She is the president and founding CEO of Virgin Unite and a B team leader. She sits on the advisory council of the elders, as well as on a number of boards, including RMI, Just Capital, and Virgin Unite. Her book, Partnering, Forge the Deep Connections That Make Great Things Happen, is her brand new book. And that is our focus today. And Jean, I'm so glad that you are here. Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast.
Thank you, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. Let's see what people are telling us. Let's see. We've got someone from Egypt. We've got someone from Sarasota, Florida, and we've got Paul from McKinney. Hi, Paul. Good to see you from McKinney, Texas. I'm sure we have others. That tells the rest of you, yes, you can do that. You can tell us where you're from. You can also give us your questions as we go. So, Jean, I'm going to start where I often start because I think that it's helpful context and it's interesting. Right? Like you didn't wake up when you were 7 and say, I'm going to write a book about partnering someday. Like tell us about your journey. How do you end up where you ended up?
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. And welcome everyone again. Lovely to see people from all over the world. I actually started my journey right out of university in telecommunications. And I spent probably about 18 years working around the world in 7 different countries to help start up mobile phone companies. And I kind of took some what I would call disruptive detours in that journey. I worked as a Vista volunteer in America with homeless teenagers, and I also worked for the National Parks and Wildlife in Australia. And when I was doing those things, I became really fascinated with how government, not-for-profits, and business can partner together to scale change in the world. So my third kind of stage in my career was really helping start up Virgin Unite some 17 years ago, which is the not-for-profit arm of the Virgin Group. And really, we focus on how do you bring together these interesting collectives of leaders to scale systemic change in the world. And then this next chapter, through all of that, I realized how critical partnerships were and how they made us who we are in this world. So this next stage with this book, Partnering, is really all about how we forge those deep connections in our lives.
So I have to tell you, this is not a lot of people know this actually, but it seems appropriate to share it now, that every year I create a word focus of the year, and I encourage my team to do it individually and we do it collectively. And my word, Jean, are you ready? You're sitting down. My word for this year is partner.
Bravo.
So when I saw this book, I said, well, lots of books come across my desk and our desks to talk to people that want to be on the show. And I said, well, I have to take a closer look simply for that reason alone. But I'm curious, in the open, I used words like connection and relationship and stuff. And yet you picked the word partner and so I'm curious why partnering, not necessarily as the title, as much as why Why is that sort of the touchstone, or why is that sort of the organizing principle for this work?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'm so glad that you picked partner for your word this year. The reason we use the word partnering for the title is because we wanted it to be an active verb, because it's not just something you do and then you stop doing. It's something that evolves and you grow. And so that's why we chose partnering. And you'll see in the title too, and throughout the book, we use the word deep connection. Because what we really uncovered through this 15 years of exploration of some of the greatest partnerships and collaborations in our lives is that it's this handful of deep connections that make us who we are in this world and allow us really to become our best possible self, and are also the secret to how we collaborate as human beings. So you'll see that word deep connection. That is something that, again, it goes, I think what I thought, Kevin, when I started this journey 15 years ago is I thought I knew how to partner. I thought I knew how to collaborate. But what I've learned through this journey is how little I knew, and how much I had to learn. And, I sat in this meeting the other day. It was a meeting with a bunch of climate scientists, a bunch of global leaders, political leaders, and the topic was around how we solve climate change. And I started to count, and they mentioned the word collaboration 50 times. But in the room, they were doing anything but that. They were talking over each other. They were trying to be the smartest in the room. It got to the point where they were undermining each other. And at that moment, I realized just how far away we are from really understanding how to collaborate.
I want to step back. You said something that is really useful and interesting that isn't even really about partnering. You said based on having read this book, and I know that it's a 15-year journey for you to get to this book, so you certainly have learned a lot along the way, and you said that. But you said something I think is really interesting, and that is that I thought I knew how to partner, and then I learned a bunch more and learned what I didn't know. I think that that's a true statement for us in our lives. That's a profoundly useful thing for us to recognize. Like, my guess is that someone who sort of realized that partnering is an important big deal probably was pretty good at it before. And yet, when we start to unpack and understand and learn from others, we do learn how much we don't know. And I think that's maybe the big picture idea almost of this podcast. We'll have someone on talk about whatever topic, and who all of the people, I said this to you, Gene, before we started, like the people that are listening or watching are predisposed to these topics, or they wouldn't be here, right? And yet they probably know a good bit about building connections, building deep connection, and yet there's a lot more to get. So I just really appreciate that sort of opening thought. Any comments, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, and I felt like I had fantastic relationships in my life, and I feel like I did have great partnerships in my workplace, but I realized that they were more surface level connections than I wanted in my life. And I think the moment that I realized that is we had started this group called the Elders. We were just incubating it, and it was a group of global leaders that were coming together to work on behalf of humanity and the planet for peace and human rights. And it was people that I had put on this massive pedestal. So it was people like Archbishop Tutu and Leah, and President and Mrs. Carter, Mandela and Grassa. And so I started to become fascinated trying to figure out how they became who they were in the world. And what became very clear is they became who they were because of the people they surrounded themselves with, whether it was their romantic partners, their work partners, their friends, their family, and how they invested in those relationships. So that really made me obsessed with two questions. How do we build these deep connections in our lives? And the second question is then, how do you take those deep connections and ladder them up to be larger scale collaborations? And what I found, Kevin, when I went out to look for these partnerships is that all of these successful people had this superpower. And the superpower wasn't their technical skills. It was not their breadth of experience. It wasn't their breadth of connections. It was their ability to partner and build these deep connections. And so when I started to talk to them, again, I peeled back the layers and realized how little I had invested in those really deep connections in my life, which has completely changed my life over the last 15 years by changing that, pivoting. And really pivoting from looking at what I can get from my relationships to looking at what I can give to the world through my relationships.
I love that last line. That might become a quote that gets used in the promotion of this podcast. So Gene, you're talking about deeper connections. You've probably said it 5 times now. And a big part of this book is this idea of 6 degrees of connection. It's like you used the phrase a second ago, laddering up, but also could be going deeper. So there's a couple of them that I want to talk about and have you expand on a little bit more. But could you just quickly tell us what the 6 degrees of connection are?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. I think what was amazing when I first started this journey, I was going to do just 10 interviews, and I was going to do all romantic interviews. And then I interviewed Ben and Jerry, and my whole mindset changed. And then I went out and I interviewed these 65 partnerships of all types: friends, family, romantic, business. And what was so beautiful is almost right from the beginning, I started to see these amazing patterns, these beautiful patterns start to arise. And so I started to plaster the walls of my house with these patterns. And then the more interviews I did, when I got up to 30, 40, I started to code all of the wisdom in the thousands of pages of transcripts. And what emerged from that wisdom of all these great partnerships is these 6 degrees of connection. And I should say right up front that I thought that these great partnerships were kind of held for people like Archbishop Tutu and Leah, President and Mrs. Carter. And what I learned through this process of interviewing all kinds of people in partnerships is that any of us can build these deep connections in our lives. And so what the 6 degrees is really synthesizing to help people go on that journey. And they've been super helpful to me. So I chose these partnerships based on 2 things. One was longevity of their partnership. And the second was that they'd used their partnership to make a bigger difference in the world. But what was really interesting, the first degree you see is something bigger, because that sense of purpose and that profound connection of purpose and partnership didn't just feature, it dominated in all of the interviews. And then the second degree is around being all in. So how you can go all in all your relationships and not hold anything back. And then the third degree is really this beautiful set of 6 virtues that emerged. And again, all of these emerged no matter whether they were business or whether they were romantic or friends. And with trust and respect at the top, and 6 other virtues. And we called them virtues on purpose because we feel a lot of times people plaster walls with values, but they don't necessarily get lived every day. And we wanted them to be lived every day. And then
you call that the ecosystem. I'm going to come back to that. So keep going.
Yes, that's the ecosystem. And then the other 3 are just really ways that you keep the relationship and the partnership in flow and connected. So you have magnetic moments. So really thoughtful moments of rituals, daily practices, traditions that keep you connected. And then also something called celebrate friction, because these partnerships flipped my whole thinking on conflict and friction and how they used it to deepen their connection. And then the last degree is something that I'm calling collective of connections, which is really how do you take your deep connections and ladder them up to big collaborations, like protecting the ozone hole, ending apartheid. So we studied a lot of those collaborations as well.
So of the 6, as I said, what I was going to do is I was going to pick a couple that I wanted us to dive into. And I made the choice on the 2 that I picked as I thought about the audience and what might resonate and might really help us most. And I'm going to start with number 5, because in our work with leaders and teams around the world, we hear about conflict all the time. People want to talk about how do we resolve conflict. And yet we always say that conflict isn't necessarily bad. Like if we're all thinking exactly the same thing, we have too many people, right? So you frame that not as conflict, but as friction, right? So one of your 6 degrees of connection is celebrating friction. So can we go a little deeper there? Like I can say, maybe I could say, okay, I want to resolve it. Maybe I can even say I can overcome it. Maybe I can even say, well, it's not all that bad, but celebrating, that's like a whole nother level, Gene.
Yeah, and this was the interesting thing. Firstly, I should say that none of the partnerships were perfect, and everyone has friction. So if you have friction, you're normal. And what I found, though, was interesting. When I first started these interviews, everyone said to me, you have to get to the drama, you have to get to the screaming, the shouting, the plate throwing. And I really tried that in the beginning of my interview process. But what I found with these great partnerships is they had created these tools to flow above the drama and figure out how they turn friction into a learning moment. And, Bertrand and Andre, two friends who started Solar Impulse and did the first solar flight around the world, they called it the sparkles. So they talked about when they had friction, they turned it into a moment where they could actually better themselves. And they talked about it as not competing with each other, but competing with themselves to become better. And they had all kinds of tools. Two examples of their tools. One was they always started with understanding the why. So why is that person coming from that perspective or framing? And putting yourself in a perspective of understanding that they have a good intention, not coming from a place of bad intention. Another example that they used all the time is they would also, in their mind, whenever they had friction, ask themselves the question, what if the other person is right? What if the other person is right? So starting from that place of thinking, I may not be right. I may not have all the answers. I need to sit and listen to this other person. And, I can go through and there's hundreds of really interesting tools, like Ben and Jerry had something called veto power. So if they ever got in a conflict that was potentially going to destroy the friendship they held at the highest value, so they would be able to have veto power and stop the other person from going in that direction if they really felt strongly about it. And they said they used it very, very rarely in their lives, but they knew that it was there. And there was a beautiful thing that, I interviewed a lot of people that were from completely different political aisles, completely different religious aisles, so across all divides. And like the two academics, Cornel West, who's social democrat far left, and Robert George, who is conservative Christian far right. Those two are deep, deep friends. And when I interviewed them, they almost looked like they stopped in time because they were listening so intently to each other. And they talked about this deep sense of respect. And that when they finished the interview with me, the challenge they posed to me was go out and find a friend that unsettles you. So go out and find
Say that again.
Go out and find a friend that unsettles you. And how important it is to have that electric current of difference running through your partnerships that challenge you and push you to be your best self. But this one, Celebrate Friction, again, I could go on for hours because there was 12 incredible tools. But one of the most important ones was also just keeping things in perspective. Like a lot of them use the language, remember the other 99 things about your relationship and your partnership. Or two incredible partners, Derek and Beverly Jobert, that work with big cats in Africa. They said that anytime they had friction, they kept in the back of their mind, would this be in our memoir when we're 90 years old?
How big of a deal is this really? I picked this one for two reasons, and I led with the first reason, which was, the whole thing about conflict and how people feel about it and how much challenge people have with it. But the other reason that I wanted you to talk about that one is you sort of hinted at it near the end here, and that is that there's so much in our world today, maybe more than ever, where if we don't agree, then we can't like each other, right? And you just straight up, and there's other beautiful examples in the book of that fallacy of how we should get past that fallacy. And I just think that that's a way that at least in our current moment, as we sit here in March of 2022, where we as society have kind of lost that. And so if that's the one thing that people could take from this book and sort of get in touch with, even if it isn't in deep partnership, even if it's just in everyday conversation, man, we'd be so much better off all the way around. The other one of the six that I wanted, anything you want to say about that before I go on?
Yeah,
you were sort of looking like, oh, I should let you back in on that. Go ahead.
I couldn't resist. I'm sorry, because this is such an important point, particularly in America right now, and everywhere in the world, actually, with what's unfolding in Ukraine. But I think we can, there was a lovely line that people used all the time, which is, we can disagree as long as we're not disagreeable. And so disagree, but don't become disagreeable. And, a lot of them talked about how they could hold that safe space to have completely opposing views, but still hold the respect for one another and still have positive, healthy discourse with one another and hopefully learn from one another. And I think not being afraid to get external help too. A lot of them talk. Burton, John Jacobs, who started Life is Good, talked a lot about, you can't see the label from inside the jar. So not being frightened to get a third party in to help when you do have friction that becomes unmanageable.
Yeah. And the other one of the six that I wanted us to talk about just for a second uh, is this idea of magnetic moments. And in the book, I see sort of two things going on here, like actual moments that sort of change everything. But the other piece is this idea of rituals, traditions, approaches. You could say, even in a relationship of two people, of a culture of how we do things around here. Like, talk about this one a little bit. Maybe give people a couple of quick tips here.
Yeah, and these came in all kinds of forms. I was stunned at how thoughtful people were about putting rituals of connection and traditions in place. And they came in the form of joy and wonder, curiosity, community around them, and also communications. And just bridging to the last discussion we had, Airbnb had a beautiful one that I've actually stolen and used in my team, where they have something that I never thought I put these three words together, but elephant, dead fish, and vomit. So what they do is they have a safe space within their team meetings for people to bring up any elephants in the room that might not be being talked about, any dead fish that are issues that need to be addressed, but no one's addressing them, or vomit when you just need to get something off your chest. And so they held that safe space, and tons of others, like the two founders from, or the three founders from Innocent Drinks. They had what they called the CEO show once a week, where they had open door, they all three were together, and anyone could come to them and talk to them about an issue or a question or anything at all. And one of the most beautiful things from the businesses that I interviewed is they also extended a lot of these rituals to their customer base, so that they brought them into their community and built those richer, deep connections with their community as well.
So I promised earlier that one of the six degrees of connection is this idea of the ecosystem, and we were talking about that, and you were talking about the virtues related to that, and there's a bunch of stuff there, way more than way more than we can unpack here. But among those components of the ecosystem, which is the one that maybe is your personal favorite? Is there one, or one that you just feel like, now this is the one I want to talk about with Kevin and everybody right now?
So I would say that trust and respect are almost givens, and you can read lots of ways that companies even built their businesses on it. But I guess one that I'd love to talk about right now is shared generosity, because it featured so much in the interviews. And it was a beautiful sense of how people come together, and they also link in the humility. And there was another one's called shared humility, and people coming together and realizing that they don't have all the answers or the skills. And they showed that shared generosity in all kinds of ways, like these amazing brothers, the Delhi brothers, who had something called Golden Palm Investments across the African continent. They've built shared generosity deeply into their company. So, for example, they have shared prosperity, where everyone in the company has shared ownership of the business, right down to the person that cleans the windows, the person that does the reception area. They also have this sense of shared just generosity with each other, which was actually born out of their mother, who they called the CEO of Us. And she had this amazing ritual where she had them every night look at themselves in the mirror and ask themselves, what have they done to improve someone's life that day? And she also had this amazing ritual where she rewarded them all together if one of them did something amazing, but she also punished them as a collective if one of them did something wrong. So it was this sense of collective and collective generosity, and that flowed through, again, all of the interviews in some way, shape, or form. And like the one quote that I love from Richard Reed, one of the co-founders of Innocent Drinks, said, you have to look at this as how you build Legos, not puzzles. And what he was talking about was that shared generosity of understanding different skill sets and celebrating and leaving space for them. And if you have a puzzle, you have everyone fitting perfectly into the puzzle with the same skill sets. When you have a Lego structure, you build on it and you have the shared generosity of and respect for everyone's skills in the company. And sometimes it can get a little bit wobbly when you get into moments of the difficult structure, but then it builds up and something much more extraordinary than you could ever do on your own.
So now I want to ask you a question that we would never have thought to ask. Well, a little more than 2 years ago. Like in a lot of, some of the interviews that this work is based on are romantic relationships, and many of them are people that are working together side by side. What is your advice or thoughts about doing this, trying to build these levels of deep connection virtually? Do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, and this is a super important question for the world right now. And thank you for all the work. I know, Kevin, you're doing a lot of work in this area. I would say one of the most important things is that degree around magnetic moments. Because what you have to do is almost over index on that to stay connected to one another. So, like, I know personally, we found as a team that we just over indexed on the amount of times we were connecting. We still even do it today. We started at the beginning of the pandemic, but we have check in points throughout the week. We have many more team meetings than we did before. And I think that has been really important. And also, not just having just check in points, but having celebrations on that and doing things that are wacky and fun and silly and coming together to really connect, but also having points of places where people can really share and be vulnerable. And I don't know about you, Kevin, but one of the things that we found as a team is we actually became more connected and more vulnerable going through this together. And having those magnetic moments was super important. And coupling those with that ecosystem of virtues so that you have that respect and trust for each other. And you work harder at deepening that when you're not able to see each other face to face.
Well, we'll do that, work harder at it, but there's a role for the leader to make sure that that's seen as valuable and important as well, right? Without question. I think there's of all of the things that we could say about the pandemic that we won't say today, of all the things we could say both positive and negative, one of the things I think you're right. When we have a shared experience, it gives us a place and a space from which to share that experience. And if we've created some safety around that idea of creating that shared vulnerability, I think has certainly been true. As there's certainly been that opportunity, and that opportunity still exists, I think, for us moving forward. So, Gene, before we start to wrap this up, and we're talking, if you missed the start, we're talking with Jean Oelwang about her great book, Partnering: Forge the Deep Connections That Make Great Things Happen. Is there anything we didn't talk about that maybe you wished we had?
I think just following on from your last point on the shared experience, I think that's where that first degree, something bigger, is so important. Because again, what I saw with our team internally, what I saw with all these interviews, is that having that clear purpose and that something bigger that you're driving towards as a team or as a partnership. And it doesn't need to be one specific purpose, it could be multiple purposes, but having that something bigger keeps people motivated, keeps them wanting to work together, and it keeps them loving their jobs. And we all talk about the great resignation right now, but if someone comes to work feeling part of something bigger, there's no stopping them. And working
They're
as a
not resigning from that. I'm here to tell you.
yeah, it's a wonderful, and so I guess the one thing I'd like to reiterate is the importance of having that purpose and having a really clear purpose that people understand and that they can run towards. And it also helps lift people above. There's no time for politics anymore, no time for drama. If you're working towards something really big, it just lifts you out of that.
Yeah.
And so that's the one thing I would add is just making sure all of us in our teams, particularly right now in the world that needs it more than ever, has that mission and that purpose at the center of all we do.
One of the many great pleasures, great benefits for Kevin personally in doing this, and people sometimes say, "Well, why would you keep doing this 330 episodes in, or 331?" I think we said, Gene, it is that I get the chance, and I think for all of you who are watching or listening, the same. You get the chance to really see people who are passionate about their expertise, that are passionate about what they've written about or what they're doing every day. And that is so awesome to see that, to be reminded of that, maybe to be lifted back to our own in that moment of seeing it in others. And yet, I always like asking this question. Okay, putting that aside,
Mhm.
Jean, what do you do for fun?
Yeah, it's hard to put that aside because I think
I
some of
know,
my
because you want to say, well, I love my work, and I get all that, and I
no, no,
and
no,
I
but some of the
and I
most
get that, right? But I,
2 hours of an interview with Ben and Jerry laughing really hard was really fun. But okay, so the other thing that I absolutely love is I love being in nature. I love scuba diving, and I love learning the curiosity about nature. And like I don't know how many people on this call know that a horseshoe crab saved all of our lives because its blue blood is the thing that they use to test the vaccines. So I just love the amazing things we can learn from nature. And I really believe that Mother Nature is probably the world's greatest entrepreneur.
oh, Mother Nature is the world's greatest entrepreneur. There's one for us all to think about. So now the question I ask everybody, and the only thing I told you I was going to ask ahead of time, and that is, what are you reading? And you said you had a couple things.
So one of my favorite books from the last year was The Overstory by Richard Powers, because I think he just weaves a beautiful story about the environmental crisis, the planetary crisis we're facing in a fictional book, which is a difficult thing to do. And then the book that I'm reading right now, which is giving me even more hope in humanity, is Humankind by Rutger Bregman. A beautifully, beautiful written book where he's just going through and looking at we tend to focus on individualism and, selfish pursuits, and we think that that's what humanity is all about. And it's not. Certainly through this process that I've gone through over the last 15 years, I've realized that actually building these relationship deep connections are the most important thing we can do. And what Rutger does really beautifully is he shows that at our hearts as human beings, we are built for goodness and we're built to be connected to one another. And he just does that in a very scientific method.
Completely, 100%, making it almost irrefutable, the outcomes that he comes to, the conclusions that he comes to. So, Jean, before we start to wrap this all up, where do you want to point people? Where can they learn more about you? How do they connect with you, etc.?
Yeah, the website. So what we did alongside the book is we started a not-for-profit called Plus Wonder. So it's pluswonder.org. And at pluswonder.org, with all 65 partnerships, we actually film them. And so you can see short video clips for each of the 6 degrees. You can take a connection test to see how deep your connections are. And you can learn from some of these great partnerships on pluswonder.org.
It's been there the whole time by Jean's name if you've been watching, but pluswonder.org is where you want to go. And so uh, now I have a question for all of you, not for Jean. She gets to take a breath. She can even take a sip of her water if she wants. But the question I have for all of you is this: now what? What action are you going to take as a result of this? Maybe you came into this thinking about this from a business perspective, and maybe you leave now thinking about it differently, or vice versa. Maybe you got a very specific idea around celebrating friction that you want to do something with. Maybe what your next step is to go to pluswonder.org. Maybe what you want to do is think about, how do I focus on the good intention of others around me first? Or to remember, I love this, we went really quickly, but remember the other 99 things I like about this person, as opposed to this one thing that right now is causing me heartburn. What is it that you took from this that you can go apply? Because unless you do that, none of this will have made any difference. None of it will move the needle for you, for your partnerships, for your connections, for your relationships. None of that will happen if you just sort of take this in while you're riding your stationary bike or whatever you're doing right now and not take any action. I hope that, and I think both of us hope, that you'll take real action as a result of having been here. So, Jean, thank you so much for having been my guest. It was a pleasure to have you. I've enjoyed our time greatly. And if others enjoyed it as much as I did, then we were successful. So thanks for being here.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kevin. And thanks for all you do in this world.
It is my pleasure. It's why I'm here. And man, I am so glad that all of you joined us. And I'm betting that if you've listened to this start to finish, you're glad as well, but which means that you need to come back next week, right? Because we're here every week, most every week here live and the same, whatever channel you're watching on, but certainly on the podcast. If you're listening to this every week, there's a new episode, and every week, I hope that you'll come back and join us for another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Kevin.